Welcome to Min 540, Ministry and Culture, Module 1, Lecture 1. I'm Dr. Matt Lovren, and our topic to get us started here in the class is definitions of culture. Culture is one of the hardest words in the English language to define. It's very slippery. We're going to look at a lot of definitions, but it's important before we get too far into our class together. It's talking a lot about cultural engagement with the gospel of Jesus Christ and how we as Christians can both interact with and engage and evaluate the culture around us for the sake of the gospel. We need to get a working definition of culture under our belts. If you remember back to Min 501, the program seminar, we did a little bit of this kind of work, but now we're going to dive in.
So let's start by looking at some definitions of culture, and we'll begin with D.A. Carson's 2008 book, Christ in Culture Revisited. It's one of the books that was written around the time of the 50-year anniversary of Niebuhr's Christ in Culture. And just at the very beginning of the book, he provides a number of helpful definitions of culture just to get after this topic, which can be very tricky and difficult to define. Incidentally, and just by way of an aside, Carson in this book is kind of the opposite end of the continuum from James K.A. Smith's Desiring the Kingdom. In fact, there's some healthy repartee and disagreement between the two. Carson is critiquing Smith in the second half of this book and really believes that biblical worldview intellectually creates right and faithful Christian practice, whereas Smith is saying the opposite. It's Christian practice that creates right biblical thinking and worldview. And so they don't really disagree on what the shape of the church should look like. It's more they disagree on what Christian education should look like, and it's a theme for both books. So that being said, let's get after Carson's own definition, where he says, the set of values, culture is the set of values broadly shared by some subset of the human population. So we're after values, but we're also narrowing the definition. We're providing a somewhat of a limiter by talking about subsets of the population. That may be cultural and ethnic, it may be linguistic, it may have to do with socioeconomic class, it might have to do with men and women, or adults and children, and generational questions. So as long as we are talking about values that are shared by some subset of the population, we've limited our discussion of what culture can be. Second, he identifies a definition by Robert Redfield, which is shared understandings made manifest in act and artifact. So that has to do with not only what we value, but also what human beings understand and share together. It may be principles, it may be ethics, it may be ideas and beliefs in addition to values, but Redfield's definition focuses on the manifestation of those values and beliefs in act, what we actually do, and in artifact, what human beings make. Another definition Carson highlights is provided by Clifford Geertz, who says culture is an historically transmitted pattern of meanings expressed in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic form by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes toward life. So here Geertz is getting after the expression of meaning in symbols and conceptions, and it's talking about our perceptions and attitudes and our knowledge about life. It has to do with the broadest possible ways of thinking about human life and then how we express those things symbolically. Okay, a last definition provided here by Kroeber and Kluckhohn, which, if you're going to be a theorist of culture, those are pretty great names to start with. Kroeber and Kluckhohn describe culture as patterns, explicit and implicit, of and for behavior acquired and transmitted by symbols, constituting the distinctive achievements of human groups, including their embodiments and artifacts. The essential core of culture consists of traditional ideas and especially their attached values. Culture systems may, on the one hand, be considered as products of action, and on the other, as conditioning elements of further action. All right, so you can see that our definitions are getting more substantive. They're starting to sprawl out and get beyond our ability to communicate them in one cogent sentence. We need compound sentences and lots of semicolons to describe culture as we're getting into it. But I hope you can see some of the consistencies in these various definitions. We've got meaning, behavior, symbols, artifacts, what the culture actually produces. You've got the ideas and values attached to them. And there's this attendant question of whether action is produced by culture, culture is producing and influencing action, or is action a result in culture? Do we do things and then culture is the result of what human beings are doing? Okay, we've covered a few definitions of culture and we've seen some commonalities in those definitions. I want you to pause the lecture for just a moment and go and take a look at this website where you'll be able to see these definitions in addition to several others. And I want you to overview those definitions and then based on those, ask yourself the following two questions. What is my own working definition of culture? So sample those different definitions and put together your own. Maybe write that out before you go on to the next part of this lecture. And then secondly, how should Christians think about and or respond to culture? Based on biblical worldview, based on what we know to be true from Scripture, how should we be thinking about culture based on the definition that you've constructed? Once you've done that, unpause the lecture and go on to the next bit. All right, having done that, we're going to turn to some definitions of culture from a couple of authors, both of whom you'll be familiar with by the end of this class. If you think back to Min 501, we looked at Andy Crouch's Culture Making. And in this book, he defines culture as, quote, what human beings make of the world. So Crouch's focus for his project is on the way that human beings make the world. That is to say, their creativity, all of the different things that humans make, from omelets to interstates to great art to music to the buildings that we build, human beings are always making in the world. And that's why the book is called Culture Making. And he, if you recall, he calls Christians to a greater sense of stewardship and responsibility to create and build culture and cultural artifacts in the world. Second aspect of this definition is that human beings interpret the world. We're always looking at the world and we're always trying to make sense of what's going on around us. That could include responses to the beauty of creation. It could include responses to the ugliness of the fall. It could be a sense of redemption that we get from the films that we watch or the music that we listen to or the various pieces of art that we make. But human beings are not only constantly making, they're also constantly interpreting, analyzing, critiquing, judging, evaluating, using those critical thinking skills to somehow make sense of what's going on around them. So when we ask the question, what is the difference between culture and worldview? How would you draw that distinction? Think for a moment and maybe write down a note to yourself. If you have a working definition of culture, what is your working definition of worldview, and how would you talk about the difference between the two? When Andy Crouch talks about cultural artifacts, the things that human beings make, he asks four key questions, if you recall back to Min 501, four key questions that really help to define and provide interpretive information about this cultural artifact. First question, what does this cultural artifact assume about the way the world is? Second, what does it assume about the way the world ought to be? Third, what does this cultural artifact make possible or impossible? And then fourth, what new forms of culture are created in response to it? So then you might take any cultural artifact. For example, you could take what we're doing here in terms of online learning, and run that cultural artifact through these 4 questions. And really, you can learn quite a bit about it. Now let's look at another view of culture, this time from James K.A. Smith's Desiring the Kingdom. If you remember, Smith wants to invert that relationship between biblical worldview and culture. He's going to think of culture as more significantly formative on us than our actual beliefs and ideas. In that way, Smith's view is consistent with that of James Davidson Hunter and his book To Change the World. In other words, culture has way more impact on us than we normally give the culture credit for. And we sometimes think that we can overcome those cultural influences just by having a better or stronger biblical worldview. Well, both of these authors would disagree. Smith thinks that human persons are embodied actors rather than thinking things. So what we do and the roles that we play and the practices that we engage in are more significant for our view of culture than the thoughts that we think. And therefore he prioritizes practices rather than ideas. In turn, what human beings make, or cultural artifacts, practices, and institutions, Smith is going to view those through a lens of worship or liturgy, because he believes that human beings are lovers before they are thinkers. So we are going to create things, and we're going to be drawn to things, and we're going to act in response to things through this lens of worship and what we love, rather than what we necessarily believe. You can think of the way that you're attracted to your favorite songs and your favorite recording artists. These things are magnetic to us. We're drawn to them, and we find beauty in them and power and meaning, even when sometimes those songs or those artists or even those films or those books go against or are not completely in line with our biblical worldview, our right thinking. We still find ourselves drawn to them. And Smith thinks that's because we're lovers and not thinkers. And so, a last point he wants to make is that when we're thinking about culture in this kind of inverted way, we still retain a sense of antithesis, that there's a juxtaposition of the gospel and culture without having to become anti-culture or negative in our view of the surrounding culture. Okay, returning to Carson and his summary of H. Richard Niebuhr's view of culture, he highlights Niebuhr's own definition, which is helpful for us. Niebuhr says that culture is the artificial secondary environment which man superimposes on the natural. It comprises language, habits, ideas, beliefs, customs, social organization, inherited artifacts, technical processes, and values. Well, one of the reasons that we can see that H. Richard Niebuhr's work on culture has been so effective and influential is that he does have this nice, tight definition of an artificial secondary environment which human beings impose on the natural world, on the creation. So all the things that make us human and make human culture, language, ideas, habits, beliefs, customs, artifacts, technical processes, values, it all has to do, it all counts, it all matters when it comes to culture. So we could take a few key points from this definition. First, culture is social. It's the interplay and the interaction between human beings. It's the sphere of human achievement. It's what we do and what we value. And culture also involves a conservation of values within those societies or within smaller social groups. It can also involve the rejection of some values and the creation of new ones, as we see going on even in our society today. Let's provide something of a summary of where we've been thus far in the lecture. First, culture is one of the most difficult words in the English language to define, second only, one author says, to nature, in which there is this range and breadth of meaning that makes it almost impossible to narrow down culture into a succinct definition. But even though it's so slippery, at the same time we intuitively know what culture is. We interact with it, we participate in it, we're engaging with it, it's influencing us, and we're making contributions to it. We are constantly enveloped in this process of being surrounded by the culture, swimming in the culture. Third point, although they are related, there is a difference between culture and worldview. And if I could sum it up, I would say it this way, that culture is something we experience and worldview is something that we think about. So worldview has more to do with the internalization in our thought process. It's an intellectual way of looking at the world, whereas culture is our full-bodied engagement with that world. And it can include worldview. It can include our beliefs and our values and the thoughts that we think, but it's more holistic than that. It has to do with the whole person and the whole society as opposed to just the intellectual values. Lastly, our texts for this class, James Davidson Hunter, James Smith, and Kevin Van Hooser, will capitalize on the experiential dimensions of cultural analysis and engagement. So even though there's going to be a lot of thought, there's going to be a lot of theory behind these definitions of culture, our main authors are really going to focus on the experiential. And if there's one thing I could have you take away from this lecture, it would be that the experiential dimensions of cultural analysis and engagement are going to be more significant for this class than the models, than the thoughts that we think, than the definitions. How this plays out in our ministry and in our everyday lives is going to be more significant than how we think about it. So thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in the next talk.